In the heart of the city stood an old apartment complex, one that had stood there for nearly a century. The halls were long and narrow, the walls chipped, and the air inside was always cold, no matter the season. Room 23B was just like the others, yet different in a way no one could quite explain. Dark things had happened there, but no one talked about it. One fateful night, something happened that changed room 23B forever. The two roommates living there had no idea what awaited them. It started with a simple creak in the night, then whispers, until one of them discovered something lurking in the shadows. And from that point, nothing would ever be the same again. Sophie was 25, a quiet girl from a small town, seeking adventure and independence. Moving to the big city had always been her dream. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, spending most of her time at her computer, crafting logos and designs. Sophie's life revolved around deadlines and creativity, but she was also a lover of all things mysterious, true crime shows, spooky podcasts, and horror novels. Though she enjoyed the thrill of the supernatural on screen, she never truly believed in it. To her, ghosts and demons were just stories, nothing more. When Sophie found the apartment in room 23B, she thought she had struck gold. It was old but spacious, and the rent was cheap. She moved in quickly, happy with the idea of a fresh start. But after a month, she realized living alone in a new city could be isolating. So, she decided to find a roommate. Leah, 26, had recently gone through a rough breakup and was looking to leave her old life behind. She was spiritual, always looking for balance and energy in the universe. Leah believed in things like the power of crystals, tarot readings, and the influence of dark forces. She had dabbled in witchcraft during her teenage years, and though she never took it too seriously, she knew that some things were not meant to be played with. A year before moving into room 23B, Leah had experienced something strange. One night, while experimenting with a Ouija board with friends, she felt something brush against her. It wasn't physical, but it was there, a dark presence. That night, she dreamt of being watched by an unseen force. From then on, she always felt like something was following her. But she never spoke of it, convinced it was all in her head. When Sophie and Leah met, it seemed like fate. They clicked instantly. Sophie was introverted, Leah outgoing but thoughtful. They complemented each other well. Leah moved in within a week. And that's when things started to change. The first few weeks were normal. Sophie and Leah established a routine, living as roommates do, sharing meals occasionally, talking late into the night about their dreams, and respecting each other's space. The apartment, however, was unsettling. There were strange noises, but Sophie dismissed them as the sounds of an old building. Leah, on the other hand, was more sensitive. She told Sophie that she often felt watched, especially in the kitchen, where she claimed to feel an odd, oppressive energy. One evening, Leah brought home a small crystal she believed would cleanse the apartment. She placed it in the living room, saying it would balance the energy. Sophie laughed it off, not believing in any of that, but Leah was serious. She seemed genuinely afraid of something, though she wouldn't say what. That night, Sophie woke up at exactly 3 a.m. to the sound of scratching. At first, she thought it was coming from outside her window, but when she listened closely, she realized it was coming from inside the apartment, specifically from Leah's room. The noise was soft at first, but then it grew louder, more frantic, as if something or someone was trying to get out. Sophie's heart raced. She grabbed her phone, debating whether to check on Leah or not. But just as she stood up, the scratching stopped. The apartment fell silent again, except for the sound of Leah's soft breathing behind her door. Sophie told herself it was just a dream, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. From that night on, the apartment seemed to have a life of its own. Lights flickered, objects moved on their own, and Sophie started feeling an icy coldness wherever she went. One day, she came home from the grocery store to find every cabinet in the kitchen wide open, as if someone had been searching for something. Leah was at work, and Sophie had locked the door when she left. Things escalated. Sophie would find Leah standing in the middle of the living room late at night, staring blankly at the walls. When Sophie would ask what she was doing, Leah would snap out of it and say she didn't remember how she got there. One morning, Sophie woke up with scratches on her arms, deep enough to sting but not to bleed. She couldn't explain how they got there. Leah, meanwhile, had grown more withdrawn. She was no longer the bright, carefree woman Sophie had met. She barely spoke, barely ate, and dark circles had appeared under her eyes. At night, Sophie would hear Leah talking to herself in her room, sometimes in languages she couldn't understand. One night, Leah's behavior grew even stranger. Sophie came home late from a work event to find Leah sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by candles, her eyes closed, muttering under her breath. The candles flickered violently, as if caught in a wind that wasn't there. Sophie felt a cold chill run down her spine. "Leah?" she whispered, her voice shaking. But Leah didn't respond. Her muttering grew louder, the words more garbled and intense. Suddenly, the room went completely dark, the candles blew out all at once. When the lights flickered back on, Leah was standing right in front of Sophie, her eyes wide and filled with terror. "It's here," Leah said in a voice that didn't sound like her own. "It's always been here." After that night, Leah's behavior became increasingly disturbing. She stopped leaving her room for days at a time. Sophie tried to check on her, but every time she opened the door, Leah would be sitting in the corner, staring at the wall, whispering to herself. Her voice sounded unnatural, layered, as if more than one person was speaking at once. Sometimes, Sophie could swear she saw shadows moving around Leah that weren't her own. The apartment itself seemed to react to Leah's presence. Sophie would hear strange noises, scratching, footsteps, whispers, especially at night. The cold spot in the kitchen seemed to spread, chilling the entire apartment. No matter how much she turned up the heat, it never warmed. One night, Sophie woke up to find Leah standing over her bed, her eyes completely black. "It's coming for you next," Leah whispered before collapsing onto the floor. Sophie tried to wake her, but Leah was unconscious, breathing heavily. Terrified, Sophie called an ambulance, but by the time they arrived, Leah was awake and completely normal again. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with her, and Leah refused to speak about what had happened. She simply told Sophie to stay away from her room. Sophie was lying in bed, exhausted from the restless nights she had endured in the apartment. Her nerves were frayed from the constant strange occurrences, the whispers, the shadows, Leah's unnatural behavior. Tonight, though, was different. The air felt heavier, thicker. The atmosphere was suffocating, and Sophie had the unmistakable feeling that something was about to happen. At exactly 3 a.m., Sophie woke with a start, her heart pounding violently in her chest. A deep, guttural sound echoed through the apartment. It wasn't the usual scratching or faint whispers she had gotten used to. This sound was more primal, like an animal growling, and it seemed to be coming from Leah's room. Terrified, Sophie knew she had to check on Leah, despite every instinct screaming at her to stay away. With trembling hands, she pushed her bedroom door open and slowly crept down the hallway. As she neared Leah's door, it swung open on its own, revealing a sight that made Sophie freeze in her tracks. Leah was standing in the middle of the room, her back arched at an unnatural angle. Her feet were planted firmly on the ground, but her body leaned backward as if pulled by an invisible force. Her head was thrown back, her mouth wide open, emitting a low, vibrating growl. Her eyes, those once warm green eyes, were now pitch black, reflecting no light, like bottomless pits. Candles flickered wildly around her, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. On the floor surrounding Leah were strange symbols, drawn in what looked like blood. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Sophie could see her breath mist in front of her face. Suddenly, Leah's body jerked violently, her spine snapping forward, and her face contorted in agony. She was fighting something inside her. Her hands clawed at her own throat, her nails digging deep into her skin, drawing blood. Her voice, layered and distorted, spoke in a language Sophie had never heard before, harsh, ancient, and filled with malice. "Help me," Leah's voice broke through the demonic growling, but only for a second. Her eyes flickered with recognition as she looked at Sophie, her body trembling with the effort to resist. "Sophie, run." She managed to whisper, before collapsing onto her knees, her limbs twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible. Sophie stood frozen in horror, unable to move, her mind trying to make sense of the impossible sight before her. Leah's body convulsed, and the room seemed to darken further, as if all the light was being sucked out by an unseen presence. The symbols on the floor began to glow a dull red, pulsing in sync with Leah's body, as if feeding off her energy. And then it happened. Leah's head snapped forward, her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, and a deafening guttural scream erupted from her throat. But it wasn't just her voice, it was multiple voices, layered on top of each other, echoing around the room. The lights flickered and exploded, plunging the room into darkness, save for the glow of the bloody symbols. Leah's body lifted off the ground, hovering in the air as if being held up by invisible hands. Her arms flailed wildly, and her legs kicked as she fought against the force that had taken hold of her. Sophie could only watch in helpless terror as Leah's mouth moved again, but this time, it wasn't her speaking. "She belongs to us now," the demonic voice hissed through Leah's twisted smile, her black eyes locking onto Sophie. "And soon you will too." Sophie's body shook with fear as Leah's body contorted again, her limbs twisting in unnatural directions. Bones cracked and popped, but Leah didn't scream in pain. Instead, her head lolled to the side, and she grinned, a horrifying inhuman grin that stretched too wide for her face. Suddenly, Leah's body dropped to the floor with a sickening thud, but the room wasn't silent. From the shadows, Sophie could hear faint whispers growing louder, like hundreds of voices chanting in unison. They weren't coming from Leah, they were coming from all around her, filling the room, seeping into the walls. Leah slowly rose to her feet, but she wasn't Leah anymore. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet on strings. She turned to Sophie, her eyes still black, but her expression was different. It was calm, too calm. And that's when Sophie saw it. Behind Leah, a shadow, no, a figure, stood tall, its shape barely visible in the dim light. It was massive, hunched, and its eyes burned red with malice. The demonic presence had revealed itself, using Leah as its vessel. Its gaze shifted to Sophie, and the air in the room seemed to thicken with its evil. Leah, or whatever was controlling her, took a step forward, her mouth still twisted in that terrible grin. "It's your turn now," she said, her voice a distorted echo. "You've been chosen." Before Sophie could react, Leah lunged at her with unnatural speed, her hands outstretched, her fingers now more like claws. She grabbed Sophie's throat, pinning her against the wall. Sophie gasped for air, her vision blurring as the grip tightened. Leah's face was inches from hers, and Sophie could feel the overwhelming heat radiating from her body. Leah's eyes flashed red for a brief moment as the demonic voice growled, "You can't escape us. We are already inside you." Sophie's body convulsed as she felt a cold, dark force enter her, like a shadow slithering into her soul. Her mind screamed in terror, but her body was paralyzed, trapped by the overwhelming power of the demonic presence. Suddenly, Leah's body began to twitch uncontrollably. Her grip loosened, and she staggered backward, her hands clutching her head as if trying to fight something off. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and her body convulsed violently. Then, with one final horrifying snap, Leah's body went limp. She collapsed to the ground, her head twisted at an unnatural angle, her lifeless eyes staring up at Sophie. The room fell silent. Sophie collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, her body shaking uncontrollably. But it wasn't over. The whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding her. The symbols on the floor flickered one last time before fading into nothingness. But the cold remained. The shadows lingered. And Sophie knew, deep down, that the demon hadn't left. It was still there, watching her, waiting. The police arrived the next morning after Sophie's panicked calls. They found her in the apartment, huddled in the corner of the living room, her eyes wide with terror. Leah's body lay lifeless in the bedroom, but there were no signs of foul play. The symbols on the floor had vanished, and the apartment looked normal. Too normal. The officers tried to calm Sophie down, but she wouldn't speak. She kept muttering the same phrase over and over again, "It's still here. It's inside me." Days passed, and Sophie left the apartment, but she wasn't the same. She moved to a new city, far away, trying to escape the horrors of that night. But every night, as she lay in bed, she could still hear Leah's voice echoing in her mind, "It's your turn now."